U.S. President Donald Trump says a 50% copper tariff is coming August 1st, and Canadian copper.
President Donald Trump announced a new tariff. This time, the target is copper. All imports will be charged a 50% duty starting August 1st.
We're going to be putting a very large tariff on chips and semiconductors.
Canadians are reasonable, and we are polite, but we will not back down from a fight.
It began with a signature on a piece of paper, but the impact was felt like an earthquake across the global economy. A 50% tariff on imported copper announced by Washington set off a chain reaction that no one could contain. Within a single night, copper prices on the COMEX exchange broke records, climbing to $5.95 per pound. Traders watched in disbelief, and the US balance sheet instantly absorbed a $4.2 billion blow. Then came the retaliation. Canada, the nation supplying nearly half of America's refined copper, froze contracts and cut shipments. Mining giants pulled the plug on deliveries, and Ottawa made its position crystal clear. Trade cannot survive when trust is shattered. The lifeblood of modern industry, copper, was suddenly trapped in a standoff, and the effects spread with alarming speed. Factories slowed, electronics, construction and automakers braced for shortages. What was once a silent metal in the background of daily life now stood at the centre of a conflict that could reshape industries. The question is, how far will this crisis go, and can the United States endure the pressure it created for itself when Donald Trump activated Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act and declared copper a strategic material vital to national security? The United States crossed a line that would reshape its industrial landscape. Beginning August 2025, a 50% tariff on all imported copper came into force, and with it came a ripple effect across markets, industries and entire economies. What appeared at first to be a protective shield for American producers quickly revealed itself as a destabilizing gamble. Copper prices in the United States reacted instantly. On the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, futures contracts spiked 13% in a single day, breaking records at nearly $6 per pound. But while American buyers were forced to grapple with skyrocketing costs, the London Metal Exchange told a very different story. Instead of following the surge, prices in London dipped slightly, driven by fears that American demand would collapse under the weight of tariffs. This divergence created something new and dangerous, a price gap as wide as 25% between US copper and global copper. Suddenly, traders were rushing to exploit an arbitrage market that exposed deep cracks in Washington's protectionist logic. The shockwaves did not take long to reach America's closest ally and biggest copper supplier. Canada, responsible for sending more than half its copper exports south of the border in 2023, responded with precision rather than emotion. Within days, Ottawa announced a shift in strategy. The United States would no longer be treated as a dependable partner, and contracts were frozen as miners were urged to reroute supply chains toward Asia and Europe. For decades, Canadian copper had flowed almost automatically to American ports. Now that pipeline was severed. The message from Canada was simple but powerful. Dependence would no longer define its economic future. Mining giants in Quebec and British Columbia, companies like Glencore and Hudbay Minerals, quickly adjusted their export routes, preparing shipments not for American refineries but for buyers in Japan, South Korea and China. The very lifeline of US copper supply was being rerouted across oceans, and with it came the prospect of an enduring realignment of trade. For the American economy, the consequences are alarming. A tariff designed to protect national interests has made the very metal that powers industry harder to access. Copper is embedded in every circuit board, every power line, every vehicle, every telecommunications tower. The United States produces only a little over half of its refined copper needs. In 2024 alone, the country imported more than 800,000 tons, with Canada, Chile, Peru and Mexico as the largest suppliers. By raising tariffs without securing a reliable domestic replacement, Washington created a shortage that no quick fix can resolve. American refining capacity adds to the dilemma. Major facilities have been shutting down rather than expanding. Osaka in Arizona has seen closures, and other plants across the southwest lack the scale to cover the massive gap left by lost imports. This reality makes the tariff less a shield and more a trap. Instead of protecting industry, it leaves businesses paying higher prices while scrambling for limited supply. Analysts have compared the situation to the Hoover years of the 1930s, when protectionist policies accelerated global economic stagnation and cut the United States off from international trade flows. The risk today is eerily similar. Higher copper costs are already feeding into broader inflationary pressures, driving up expenses in sectors from automotive manufacturing to energy infrastructure. Telecommunications firms warn of delayed projects. Electric vehicle makers face cost explosions that threaten expansion plans. Construction firms find themselves rewriting budgets almost weekly. All of it traces back to one decision in Washington. Canada's counter-strategy only intensifies the pressure. By redirecting copper exports away from the United States, Ottawa is not retreating but advancing into new territory. territory. A $1.8 billion investment package was unveiled to strengthen export capacity beyond North America. The plan includes infrastructure for new shipping routes and expanded facilities to serve Asian markets. That figure signals far more than an economic adjustment. It marks the beginning of a transformation. Canada is positioning itself not as a supplier dependent on American demand, but as a strategic competitor shaping the global copper trade. The effects of this pivot are already visible. Raw copper from Canadian mines is being shipped overseas to be refined in Asia, cutting the United States out of a supply chain it once dominated. At the same time, long-term agreements are being negotiated with buyers in Tokyo, Seoul and Beijing, ensuring that even if US policy were to reverse course tomorrow, Canada's dependence on American consumers would never return to its former level. Ottawa has redrawn the map of its economic alliances, and Washington finds itself on the outside looking in. For American manufacturers, the implications are severe. Refining plants already constrained will struggle even more to secure raw material. The cost of copper wiring, electric motors and essential components will continue to climb, feeding inflation that households cannot escape. The burden will fall on consumers, whether through rising energy bills, costlier vehicles or more expensive housing projects. A metal once taken for granted is becoming the fault line of an economic conflict that is reshaping trade on a global scale. The real turning point, however, is not only in economics but in perception. Canada has demonstrated that it will not allow Washington to dictate the rules of trade without consequence. By mobilizing billions in investment and forging new markets, it has turned a position of vulnerability into a strategy of strength. Copper exports worth over $9 billion annually have shifted from being a symbol of dependence to a weapon of leverage. Ottawa has shown that even a smaller economy, when holding a critical resource, can push back effectively against the world's largest power. The American administration, in pursuing protectionism, hoped to create self-reliance. Instead, it exposed the weakness of domestic infrastructure and the reality that supply chains cannot be rebuilt overnight. The refining industry remains too limited, production cannot expand quickly enough, and alternatives are scarce. Far from achieving independence, the United States has been pushed to the margins of a supply network increasingly centered elsewhere. Analysts warn that if Canada's export redirection succeeds, the United States could lose its privileged position in copper access permanently. Asia would emerge as the new hub of copper refining and trade, leaving Washington dependent on global prices it cannot control. That scenario would reshape not only the copper industry but the entire balance of industrial power. Canada's move is a structural shift that signals the rise of a new competitor in the metals market. With billions invested and new alliances in place, Ottawa is positioning itself as a central player in the race for control over resources that drive modern economies. The United States, once at the heart of this chain, risks becoming a bystander. This story of copper is no longer confined to warehouses, mines or futures contracts. It has reached into homes, cars and workplaces. Every consumer in America will feel its weight. From the price of electricity to the cost of a smartphone, the tariff on copper has transformed from a political decision into a daily reality. Canada did not respond impulsively. It responded with a clear and deliberate plan to reduce reliance on the United States, to secure diversified markets and to elevate itself from supplier to competitor. In this process, Washington has been handed a lesson about the limits of unilateral power in a world where resources shape strategy as much as politics. And during all this, one fact has become impossible to ignore. A policy aimed at protection has triggered a crisis that reverberates far beyond copper markets. The costs are rising, the supply lines are tightening and the consequences are spilling into every sector of the economy. What started as a story about an industrial metal is now creeping into every car, every power line, every tech product, making it impossible for anyone to ignore the full-scale tension of this tariff policy. Furthermore, the 50% copper tariff did not only provoke Canada's retaliation, but it also created a shock, because copper is not an accessory material that can be substituted easily. It is the backbone of modern infrastructure, the silent element running through every circuit board, every wire and every motor. Each electric vehicle carries nearly 80 kilograms of copper in its wiring, batteries and motors. So when tariffs forced copper prices to surge, analysts quickly calculated that the cost of producing every new EV rose by close to $90. On the surface, that number might appear modest, but when multiplied across tens of thousands of vehicles rolling off production lines, it translates into staggering losses for companies already struggling with slim margins. Industry experts warn that this shift is not confined to paper calculations or quarterly forecasts. It has already stalled projects, drained budgets and forced companies to rethink strategies. Automakers like Tesla and Ford are watching millions disappear every month as production costs climb and key projects are delayed or cancelled. Several EV programs in states such as Michigan, Ohio and Indiana have been forced into suspension not because of lack of demand, but because the material essential to producing them has been thrown into turmoil. The damage extends far beyond headline brands. Smaller manufacturers specializing in electrical wiring and consumer electronics are facing an even sharper blow. In states across the Midwest, the price of imported copper wire has jumped nearly 18%, making it impossible for these firms to compete with suppliers in Southeast Asia, where copper prices remain far more stable. Contracts once guaranteed to American factories are now shifting to companies in Vietnam and Thailand, leaving American workers and business owners on the sidelines. At the same time, utilities tasked with maintaining and expanding the nation's power grid are struggling to contain costs. Copper-based conductors and transformer cores have seen price spikes of more than 20%, pushing utility companies to file emergency requests for electricity rate hikes. Those increases will not remain in boardrooms or on spreadsheets. They will soon show up in monthly bills sent to households already grappling with inflation. A recent UBS report underscored the seriousness of the crisis. It projected that US GDP could shrink by 0.5 percentage point this quarter alone as major industrial sectors stall. Losses from the tariff fallout already amount to more than $4 billion, matching almost exactly the volume of copper trade frozen when Canada cut ties with the US supply chain. That is not a coincidence. It is evidence of how deeply dependent the American economy has become on copper imports and how dangerous it can be to disrupt a network that supports entire industries. The disruption is far-reaching. Construction firms are battling higher costs for copper-based insulation and wiring, pushing project expenses upward at every stage, from residential homes to large-scale developments. Energy companies are raising alarms about delays in renewable energy installations, since copper is critical for wind turbines, solar arrays and transmission systems. Telecommunications giants are preparing for supply bottlenecks in equipment needed to expand broadband and 5G networks. Every one of these sectors relies on copper, and every one of them is now absorbing the shock of policy choices that ignored the complexity of supply chains. The immediate burden has already reached American households. Higher electricity bills, costlier home repairs and more expensive consumer goods are direct results of copper inflation. Ryan Young from the Competitive Enterprise Institute explained to CBS News that tariffs on copper will increase the cost of power transmission and grid maintenance, and those costs cannot remain hidden. Consumers, he warned, will inevitably shoulder the expense. The corporate toll is growing as well. Automakers like General Motors have admitted to billions in losses from earlier tariffs and now face fresh financial wounds from copper. GM acknowledged a $1.1 billion loss tied to trade conflicts before the copper crisis even began. With tariffs inflating copper prices further, the company and its rivals are bracing for even deeper hits to their bottom lines. Profit margins are shrinking across industries, forcing companies to delay investments, slash budgets, and in some cases consider layoffs to offset soaring costs. The deeper problem lies in structural limitations within the American copper industry itself. In 2024, the United States imported more than half of the copper it consumed, primarily from Canada, Chile, Peru and Mexico. Domestic refining capacity accounts for only about 5% of national demand, far too little to fill the gap created by the tariff. Home construction projects are more expensive by as much as $17,000 to $22,000 per build. And those increases are not limited to large ticket items. The copper inside every light bulb socket, every in-wall wire and every EV charging port is steadily raising costs for consumers across the board. Instead of integrating into a global system that could have helped stabilize supply and reduce risks, the United States has turned inward, relying on tariffs that isolate it from markets and inject uncertainty into every level of industry. The result is a system more volatile, more expensive, and less predictable than the one it replaced. Was this really the turning point America wanted, or the beginning of a costly retreat from the global trade stage? A $4.2 billion loss could be the first shot in a new economic era where the United States is no longer calling the shots. The world is watching closely and the fallout is only starting to unfold. So what do you think? Are these tariffs a bold stand for independence or a misstep that could backfire on America's future? Share your thoughts below and don't forget to hit subscribe so you're always up to date. Thanks for tuning in and see you next time.